It's now over 40 years since the publication of Bradbury's novel, and one might have thought that Kirk's thoroughgoing belief in the wonderful new society that could be attained by the overthrow of capitalism and the annihilation of the bourgeoisie would have been, well, somewhat tempered by later historical events. But here, according to my next guest, is what really happened. Quote, "For a while, it even looked as though there might be an apology forthcoming from those who had devoted their intellectual and political efforts to whitewashing the Soviet Union or praising the People's Republics of China and Vietnam. But the moment of doubt was short-lived. Within a decade, the left establishment was back in the driving seat, with Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn renewing their intemperate denunciations of America, the European left regrouped against neoliberalism, as though this had been the trouble all along, Dworkin and Habermas collecting prestigious prizes for their barely readable but impeccably orthodox books, and the veteran communist Eric Hobsbawm rewarded for a lifetime of unswerving loyalty to the Soviet Union by his appointment as Companion of Honour to the Queen." Strong words indeed, strong words from a new book called Fools, Frauds and Firebrands, Thinkers of the New Left. The author who now joins me is Roger Scruton, who's visiting professor in philosophy at the University of Oxford. And also with me in the studio I have Mark Fisher, who's lecturer in visual cultures at Goldsmiths, University of London. Now, Roger, you argue in that passage that the left has regrouped, so you need to take renewed aim, if you like. But let's begin with the first time you had a shot at this particular evil or folly, as you might characterise it. That was your earlier book, Thinkers of the New Left, published while Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister. How was that received at the time?
It went down like a lead balloon, and I went down with it, I'm afraid. It was regarded as a kind of, not just an offence to all forms of decency and good manners in intellectual argument, but as proof of my complete lack of understanding and intelligence. And, I sort of... it was remained, of course, but the publisher received most appalling, threatening letters from colleagues saying that their respectable name had been besmirched by their association with me, etc. So it was not a happy time for me.
Well, we can only hope that it's not quite so bad this time round. But let's turn to this new book anyway. There's quite a cast of characters. We go from the Marxist historian E.P. Thompson, French theorist Lacan, Deleuze, the American economist Galbraith, Hungarian philosopher Slavoj Žižek, and do they really have enough in common to all belong in the same book, equally indicted, if you like, for their role in shaping a left-leaning academy?
I think they do. I realise that, they are a ragbag and they come from slightly different perspectives intellectually, but they all focus on a few very narrow issues. In particular, issue of social equality and so-called social justice, the evil of the consumer society, and the intellectual alienation that comes about through the rule of private property. All those are themes throughout. And it also has to be noted that they are all on the syllabus. They're all in the curriculum of the humanities, and some of them dominate. Some of Deleuze, for example, his works are absolutely essential. Not essential reading because they're unreadable, but they're essential reference for any student who wants to do an MA or in sociology, literature, and not so much philosophy. My subject has been relatively innocent, but
Let me bring you in here, Mark. How do you respond to this idea these left-wing thinkers, the variety of left-wing thinkers, hold sway in the economy, if like at the expense of other ways of examining the world?
Well, I think it's an interesting Freudian slip in your question there, because you said in the economy, where I think that tells us the story that, in a way, I think what Roger's saying, there's clearly some truth in it, but it's the most Pyrrhic of victories. Like the left, or certain form of left, does dominate certain areas of the academy, but those areas have very little influence beyond the academic enclave themselves. The economy, etc., the big narratives about the kind of society we live in, these are dominated by the right, by neoliberalism.
I mean, and you'd want to say that actually within universities themselves, to some extent, I mean, the marketisation of universities, you know, the ways in which they've changed over the years, suggests that all those have been moving, if you like, not in a left-wing direction at all, but towards a much more market view of university education.
Well, this is the irony of capital, that, you know, that these left-wing theories can be espoused, while the actual conditions of the university itself are corporate subjugation, you know, that almost complete subordination of almost all areas of university life to the imperatives of corporate capitalism now.
So you have the odd thing that these books, I mean, you don't deny that some of these books are on the lists. They are there in the syllabus.
I agree, and I agree that they perhaps have, in some sense, have an undue influence. But I think that, in a way, is to do with the weakness of the left to hold hegemonic power beyond specific enclaves, actually.
This is just a little university enclave, and it really doesn't have any effect upon...
Well, if that were true, I mean, that's interesting, but if it were true, it would be very bad news for the universities, because it's essentially saying that they're defining their agenda, their curriculum, their perspective on the world in terms that have no relation to that world. There is an enclave of sort of crypto-magical thinking, which you have to become expert in if you're to get a PhD or whatever, or certainly if you're to get a job, but actually it's increasingly detached from the surrounding culture. I'm not saying that the surrounding culture is healthy, but nevertheless some kind of engagement would be quite useful.
Let's talk a little bit, though, about one of your major concerns in this book is with the language being used. I mean, you referred to that already. You used George Orwell's term newspeak to describe the ways in which some academics refuse to engage with their opponents. You also use the phrase nonsense machine in relation to certain French theorists, particularly Jacques Lacan.
Yes, yeah.
Tell me about language and what language is doing here, and what are your specific objections to the language of these writers?
Well, in my view, language has a natural use, which is to say how things are and to argue from the premises of how they are as to what we might do about it. You know, and that requires straightforward speaking with words that you understand the meaning of. But in many of the thinkers that I discuss, language is used in a kind of exorbitant way, not just the invention of new terms of newspeak which have no obvious sphere of reference, but strange pronouncements. Lacan, for instance, tells me, there is no sexual relation. And I'm say, what on earth does that mean? Do you mean that people don't relate to each other sexually? By the time I've asked that question, he's moved on. That's been proven. We dismissed that. You do not exist, and I respond to that by saying, well, but I do exist. I mean, what am I doing here? But no, exist spelt EXSIST. Don't you see? You don't exist.
I mean, what you're saying is that really it's impossible to anyone to mount a proper criticism of this, because
absolutely.
You can't really, I mean, it's impossible to find where the target is.
It's a casting of spells, on the opponent, so the opponent is deprived of any weapon in response.
Do you have any sympathy for this critic? I mean, you must have found some of this.
I've a surprisingly high degree of sympathy for it, perhaps. But I mean, it's not. You can't all lay this at the door of the left. It was the right who started this off. It was Hegel and Heidegger who started off this kind of pompous, oracular kind of style, I think. I mean, but in respect of Lacan, I've read almost nothing to convince me that he wasn't a thoroughly unpleasant individual, and that he was, in some sense, his own worst enemy. That, I mean, his advocates now, people like Zizek, I think the value of Zizek, one of the big values of his work, is that he does convert what, for me, previously, before I'd read thinkers like Zizek, Lacan's completely impenetrable arguments into a clear set of propositions, actually.
And we might also say that you've missed a couple of people you've missed out almost because they run against your case. I mean, there's no mention of Barthes in your book, I don't think, Roland Barthes, who writes quite beautifully and quite clearly.
Yes.
Not always in the book on fashion, but in mythologies and elsewhere. Let's talk about a little bit about one particular theorist who you indict. I mean, that's the French philosopher Michel Foucault, a major influence on many academics. And I used to even teach a course on Foucault myself at York University. Why do you think his influence is baleful?
I think Foucault rewrote the whole of the human condition in terms of a few basic concepts. First of all, the concept of domination. He saw domination everywhere, and for him that was the fundamental fact. About every institution, every custom, there was somebody who was dominating someone else, and classes emerged from this as a byproduct. And all the language of politics and human relations for him was to be understood in these terms. His idea was that the idea of the episteme, the way in which we know things, is conditioned by the power that we exercise through doing so. So the concept of truth versus falsehood, of reasonable versus unreasonable, all those are put into a shadow by this other thing, the powerful versus the unempowered. And I think that it's a very exciting way of looking at human reality, but it's also dehumanizing, because it removes all those aspects of humanity whereby we come to an agreement with each other, come to accept things.
How would you respond to that?
Foucault, in a way, took over those ideas from previous thinkers. I think the big influences on him being Nietzsche and Sartre, and I think you can see a lot of his work as coming out of the combination of those two. And I think to be fair, you do highlight some of the problems, the kind of politics coming out of Foucault, which is, I think, in a way, an impossible politics, which is, on the one hand, you want to struggle against domination. On the other hand, continually valorising this position of the marginal, and I think that's led to quite serious problems for the left. Actually,
that is actually one reason why I was interested in him, because the impossibility that underlies the politics as you described it is something which I keep coming back to in the book. The fact that none of this is actually applicable to human beings as they are. It's all a fantasy in the minds of the intellectual. The intellectual feels excluded from ordinary everyday things.
I would just have to say that, I always found Foucault, in terms of the history of sexuality, in terms of a reversal of the Victorian idea that the Victorians were actually against all forms of sexual conversation and discussion in the history of sexuality. And then that quite wonderful, I think, history of the prison and how we moved to the prison, and you like his later works as well, very much.
He writes beautifully, and of course what he says about prisons is really quite appealing. It's clear he was a sadomasochist and he loved those things.
Now, let's one last thing. One of the trends, we haven't got time to go through all the various trends that you identify, but one in left-wing academic writings, you find this persistent anti-consumerism, don't you? Tell me about what you object to here. Surely this, I would have rather had you down as someone who rather relished this attack upon crass materialism.
I am not somebody who wants to defend the consumer culture against its left-wing critics, but I would also want to point out that there are some right-wing critics too, like T.S. Eliot and F.R. Leavis and so on, who are saying the same things. So, Matthew Arnold and John Ruskin. In our tradition, it hasn't been a left-wing sphere of influence at all. And it's something that concerns us all. We are all aware of the fact that in the abundance of modern societies we're being dragged down by our appetites. The question is, what do we do about it? Is this a political problem or a social problem or a religious problem? And I think that we have to stand back and see it in its full complexity.
You would want to say, we've got to be very quick response, but you would want to say that if you looked at some other sociologists, you might find, as it were, this ready acceptance of the idea of consumer culture is bad, simply, is not to be found.
No, if you look at the work of cultural studies, particularly after the influence of Stuart Hall, culture, consumer culture, seen more as a terrain of struggle, the appropriation of different meanings, rather than a fixed monolith.
In which we simply sit and absorb or
Yeah.
buy. Yeah. Okay. Well, I knew we would be pushed for time on this, but I hope we've managed to give some flavour of the book at least. So let me
Yes, well,
thank
thank
you, Roger Scruton. Thank you very much, and Mark Fisher. Thank you very much.